Here we are at Northside Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. More babies are born in that building behind us than anywhere else in the United States, including me. Today we're going to talk about population growth and decline. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography. Welcome to class. Today we are talking about population dynamics, which is topic 2.4 of Unit 2. So we're talking today about why is the global population increasing and what factors contribute to that increase. This chart shows us global population through the history of humanity. It starts at 8,000 BCE, which is 10,000 years ago when there were only 500,000 people on Earth. And it progresses up through the years to show us the increase of population. Population only increased over that next 8,000 years to zero to 300 million people. And it doesn't hit a billion people until about 1800. And then since 1800, we see population skyrocketing up to today's population of 7.6 billion people on Earth. So those increases go in much sharper increments since the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to look at the components of population growth and why the population grows, as well as the numbers that we study to understand population growth. So geographers measure population change in a country or the world by using three key measures. The first one is the crude birth rate. So that is the total number of live births in a year for every 1,000 people alive in a society. So the crude birth rate is the total number of live births in a year per 1,000 people. Most of these numbers are going to be represented as per 1,000. So let's look at this map of the world that shows the crude birth rate. We can see per 1,000 people on this choropleth map, the areas that are the darkest are the ones with the highest birth rate, and the areas that are the lightest are the ones with the lowest. I want you to write down three observations that you get from looking at this map. What regions of the world have the highest birth rate, and what regions have the lowest? As you can see, Canada, as well as parts of Eastern Europe, and then Japan have some of the lowest birth rates in the world. Where Sub-Saharan Africa and parts of West Asia have some of the highest, especially in that Central African area below the Sahara Desert. They have very, very high birth rates. We're going to talk about what contributes to those. The next statistic we look at is the crude death rate. That is the number of deaths in a year for every 1,000 people alive. So that's the total number of deaths in a year for every 1,000 people alive in a society. So the CDR. So this is a map of the CDR. This is crude death rate per 1,000 people. Remember, we're going to see that per 1,000 a lot today. And we see where death rates are the highest in the world. So take a second and write down three observations. There might be a few things that surprise you. We can see that the United States is on the higher side of the map. Japan is very high, but the highest we find in Russia, Eastern Europe, and then also in Sub-Saharan Africa. And there are factors that contribute to those things. So you might see the crude death rate and think that's just a lot of people dying, but because it's per 1,000, it can show us how old the society is as well. So Russia has an aging population, so does Japan, and that's why we see them having a much higher crude death rate. It might surprise you that the US has a higher crude death rate than Mexico, but our population is older than Mexico's, which means that a higher percentage of them is dying. So when we take those two numbers together and combine them, when we combine the crude birth rate and the crude death rate, it gives us the natural increase rate, the NIR. That's shown as a percent, and it's showing what percent the population is growing in a year. What you do is you take the crude birth rate and subtract the crude death rate, and that gives you the NIR. Remember, it's a percentage where the other two are per 1,000. So that way you can multiply the population by the NIR and see the growth of a society. All right, so there are other components as well that we look at. A lot of numbers and a lot of figures to remember from today. So when we're looking at the natural increase and looking at how many people are added to the world annually, we right now have about 82 million people being added each year. The rate of natural increase affects something called the doubling time. That is the number of years it takes for a population to double if you continue at the same rate of natural increase. So doubling time is the number of years it takes for a population to double at the current natural rate of increase. So in the 21st century, that rate was 1.2%. So that meant that each year they would add 1.2% of population, which meant that the doubling time was 54 years. And global population in 2100 would be 24 billion people if we continued at that rate. But then that rate slowed down. So we see like in the 60s, the rate was 2.2, which meant that it would take 35 years to double. So in 2010, we should have 10 billion people based on that number, but it slowed down. So we actually have just over 7.5 billion people. More than 95% of the natural increase is clustered in developing countries. So the countries that are growing at the quickest rate are the ones that are in developing countries, where developed countries have all slowed down in their natural increase. Here's a map of the rate of natural increase in the world. We can see again in those same areas of sub-Saharan Africa where they have very high rates of natural increase. And we'll talk about why later. We also see that in the Americas has a moderate rate of growth, and also throughout different parts of Asia. But still in Eastern Europe and Japan, we see a below zero or right around zero rate of natural increase, which means that they are either staying stagnant or they're actually declining in population. So write down 3 observations comparing the crude birth rate and crude death rate maps that we looked at to this map of natural increase. Remember that we get the rate of natural increase by subtracting the crude death rate from the crude birth rate. All right, another stat that we need to know is the total fertility rates. So fertility rate helps us to understand the number of births per woman in a society. So the way that we get this number, it's defined as the average number of children a woman will have throughout her childbearing years. So from, they say 15 to 49 is the stat that they give. So it's a pretty wide range. But what is the average number of children a woman will have during those years? It helps us to understand births in a society. So we can look at it countrywide or state or even worldwide, we can understand. The total fertility rate for the world is 2.5. So that means on Earth, women are having an average of 2.5 children in their birth-giving years. In sub-Saharan Africa, that number still exceeds 5. So that means that on average, women are having 5 or more children in sub-Saharan Africa in their life. But in most of the European countries, that number is 2 or less than 2. So we see again this gap between the developed world and the developing world on these rates of birth and then also fertility rates. Replacement level, which is what it takes to replace a population for the next generation, is 2.1. So it means that every 2 parents have an average of 2.1 children, and that will keep the population replacing and without much growth, but will replace the population that came before it. So this is total fertility rate of the world. It's represented again on a chloroplex map. We'll see a lot of chloroplex maps through this unit. And we see the areas are the darkest that have more than 5.5 children per woman. And again, we see those are found in sub-Saharan Africa. And then some of the highest in the world still in countries like Afghanistan. The lowest fertility rate, where women are having the least children, again, we see Eastern Europe, South Korea, and Japan. And there are cultural reasons for different countries having different birth rates. So another one to look at that really educates us about the healthcare of a country and the way that things are going is the infant mortality rate. It's a really sad number to look at, but it helps us to understand death rates in a society. So it's defined as the number of deaths of infants under 1 year of age compared to total live births. So it's looking at how many babies don't live to be 1 year old. It's also expressed over 1,000, but this helps us to understand like the state of healthcare and the quality of life in a place. If you have a really high infant mortality rate, that means you're in a developing or an underdeveloped country. So in developed countries, this rate is only 5 per 1,000. But in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we see this number often is 80 or higher. So looking at the chart, we can see over time, especially over the last 50 years, how this has dramatically decreased. Europe started shoring this up in the 80s, where it became extremely small. And then we see Asia's has dropped significantly. Here's another chart that shows countries. This is developed countries and infant mortality rate per 1,000 births from 2014. You can see that the United States is actually on the higher side of developed countries. We had 5.8 in 2014, where countries like Japan and Sweden were down to 2.2 and 2.1. The average developed country is about 3.4 according to the Health System Tracker. So that is it for topic 2.4. We looked at all of the different numbers that help us to understand population growth. So we looked at crude birth rate and death rate. And then when you combine those two, you get the rate of natural increase. We looked at fertility rate, which is the number of children a woman is likely to have in her childbearing years. And then we also looked at infant mortality rate. Remember to think about why certain countries have different rates of birth. And we're going to look at all of these things as we move forward in the next couple topics. So that was one step in our journey to better understand our world. I'm Mr. Coulter, and that was Human Geography.